All right, let's leave that and look at something else here. This is important. We've been talking over the last few weeks about vehicle emission standards. It's everywhere and everyone's got a point of view. The federal government obviously looking to bring in these new Euro 6 standards, as they call them, by 2025. Now, that's next year. That's next year they want this to start. Now, the rules are causing chaos in the motor industry and confusion in the public. Electric vehicle brands Tesla and Polestar have left the board of the Federal Chamber of Automotive Industries over this issue. They're unhappy with the body's, what is effectively a campaign against these new standards so quickly. And we've heard that brands with smaller lineups, companies like Isuzu, they only sell the D-Max Ute and the MU-X four-wheel drive. They claim that the new laws could see them forced to just pull out of the market altogether. Now, a market where the D-Max, let's not forget, was the fourth most popular vehicle last month, the third most popular the month before. Now, they're saying, despite their success, this might force us out. Boom, we're gone. So selling cars in big numbers, but new laws could see some leave Australia, certainly if these are rushed. Now, the negative outlook on these plans is echoed by the more traditional brands as well, stacks of them. They're worried about the timing as well as the impact the proposed measures will have on their industry. Now, we can read about this all we like. It's better when we go to the source and talk to somebody who knows what's happening on the ground. John Rocker, he's the Managing Director of Sydney City Lexus and Toyota. He's a long-time advertiser here, as you know. He knows the industry better than most. He's with me in the studio. John, it's good to see you again. Thank you for coming in.
Thanks for having me, Michael. It's good to see you.
Okay, these Euro 6 standards, we're hearing a lot about it. There's probably some truth in among all of it as well. But at the end of the day, you and a lot of those in the industry, even if you sell diesel and petrol cars like they're going out of style, you're not against this in principle. It's the practice, particularly the speed at which Chris Bowen and the government want to bring this in that's really the issue, isn't it?
Spot on. I think we all want the same thing. I think the target that we want, nobody's arguing the target. The problem that we have is the timing. It's just not realistic. It's not realistic for the consumer. It's not realistic for the manufacturers either. So eventually we're all saying that's where we need to be. And I know that the current government's getting a few knocks. The previous government didn't really have a policy. So the government's doing the right thing. The issue is that they don't understand what it takes to develop the cars that they're talking about for the consumer to be able to afford and to have the flexibility in models of choice. So we're taking away choice from the consumer. As you said, there could be brands like even Ford that could leave the country. I mean, they're selling Rangers, number one selling car last year. If that car doesn't exist, Ford probably doesn't exist.
But so you say Ford, so Chris Bowen was in his own sort of hyperbolic style. Oh, well, that's rubbish because, Ford's a big American company. The Americans are doing all this. The fact is the Americans aren't really doing this, are they? They're moving the goalposts further out just as we're trying to bring them closer in. And they've got all sorts of exemptions and loopholes which we will not apply.
Big time. I think that's been thrown out there by, those that are pushing this particular issue for the timing that they're proposing. But if you read the policy, I encourage everybody, you don't need to read an encyclopedia to work out that the Ford situation or that conversation we've just had about the US is very, very different to what we're proposing here in Australia. And Ford themselves in the US and the US in general, they're trying to protect their industry and they're changing the rules. So we've been invited to the party. We're going there late. What we've found is that when we get there, the party's not going to be there. The party has moved. So why are we going this early when we've waited so long? That's the only issue. Everything else we agree on.
And the other complicating factor, among many, of course, in the Australian market is we no longer manufacture vehicles, so we have no skin in the game. Now, the Americans can change their production cycles. The Europeans can do it. Governments can speak to domestic manufacturers and work out on the ground how this might happen, the time frames. It seems they didn't do that, or if they did, they were getting overly enthusiastic responses initially.
Correct.
The manufacturers are now saying, now listen, fellas, and the people on the ground with the Chinese imports coming in left, right and centre say, we're going to be priced out here unless we slow down so we can compete. And so they're working in the Northern Hemisphere among themselves, between industry and government, to push the time frame out in Europe and America to make sure this can happen smoothly without a massive speed hump. Here, Chris Bowen's basically said, oh no, we're just going to do it here, bang, cop it or go away. That's basically what he's arguing.
Spot on. Nobody's arguing. So if you look at Thailand manufacture our top 3 selling cars. So even the government of Thailand is approaching it and talking to our government saying, what are you doing? This is possible. We're all saying it's possible. It's where we want to go. I mean, Toyota launched a hybrid car 22 years ago. So it's not as if nobody's thinking about these things. It isn't a government idea. The car manufacturers want to do the right thing. And we all have the same target, but it's the timing. So in the short term, we're saying to Australians, we'll dictate what you buy, we'll dictate what you pay for it, which will be too much. And we're going to do this, now. And that's what it feels like for manufacturers. It can't happen now.
Now, this timing issue, John Rocker's here, by the way, if you realise the voice is John Rocker. And look, you might want to have your say on this. Give me a buzz, 131873. John, the timing issue, and we were speaking before about this, it's twofold. On the one hand, you've got the consumer being told you're going to have to change your buying habits and fast. Otherwise, there'll be financial penalties on it. But as you outlined at the very top of this conversation, the other issue to timing is from the manufacturer's point of view. Without manufacturers, you don't have cars to sell. Now,
you don't, yeah.
Our top-selling cars are utes, effectively, and SUVs. We've fallen in love with these, and so, be it necessity for work or just aesthetic choice, we're buying utes and SUVs.
Yeah.
But it takes it roughly 6 years, doesn't it, to develop a new type of ute or a new type of SUV.
Exactly.
The government isn't even really giving the developers time to develop to suit the Australian market. And for those that say, well, don't worry about that, they make all these things overseas, they can just change what they import. They're not really making a lot of battery-powered utes anywhere.
They're not.
Overseas to import now. So this all has to start from scratch.
And we're really at the beginning. I mean, everything you've just said is correct. We're really at the beginning of the cycle of the electric car. If we wait an extra few years, everybody remembers the first telephone. The first mobile phone I had looked like a briefcase.
Yeah.
I used to carry around. The phone number was 007.
You were very on trend with that,
let me tell you, if you had one of those, you stood out, right? Yeah. Now, look at our telephones today. They're not the size of a briefcase. The same applies to hybrid technology, EV technology. If we wait long enough, they'll be cheaper. They'll be better for the environment to produce. They'll take less time and they will cost less. That's where everybody's going, but nobody's talking about it. So if we slow it down and say, let's produce and work on research, not just development of cars, we'll come up with a much better product. Leave that to the manufacturers. It will happen.
Now, what about this thing that the government's saying, oh, look, everyone's going to save $1,000 in fuel. Now, we know that you're going to have to spend a schmozzle up front to buy one of these vehicles before you can save a cent in fuel. Okay,
yes.
But once you've done it, okay, electric cars, or hybrids for that matter, you're using less fuel than you would with a combustion engine. So, okay, you're saving, let's say, $1,000 a year. But...
Yeah, so we haven't been told the full story. We were told in the beginning when the electric cars were spoken about, and that was, what happens if we all drive these cars? Let's assume that, we hit the target, 80% of us are driving electric cars. We're no longer going to the fuel station to fill up the car. Where does the revenue from the fuel excise come? So I'd like the government to be a little bit more transparent with consumers and tell them what's going to happen once they drive an electric car, which is a thing called mileage tax. So that, I think, will far outgrow the $1,000 we're going to save on fuel. And that needs to be spoken about. And
no one's mentioned that.
And the other one, Michael, is a big one, is that we were projecting our local manufacturing. You mentioned earlier we don't have it. Why do we still have a luxury car tax on vehicles?
Exactly. Well, why do we? And to be fair to Chris Bowen, the other side don't want to get rid of it either.
No. And that's because it's a great tax. It's a great revenue raiser. But if you really want to encourage Australians to have more choice and get behind this scheme in the short or medium or long term, that has to go.
Now, maybe I was a little unfair. Maybe I was a little Bowen-esque in my hyperbole a moment ago. I said overseas they're not manufacturing BEV utes, battery electric vehicle utes. That's not true. There is one in the Australian market.
Yes.
It's a Chinese LDV ET60, I think. Retail price just under $93,000, if I'm not mistaken.
Correct.
Pretty expensive. Mind you, if a tradie turned up and wanted to quote a paint job at my house in one of those, I suspect he's probably doing all right, and I might get a second opinion. But how many of those, John, have been sold in Australia so far this year?
So before I give you that number, there's thousands of its competitors that are non-BEV that are sold so far this year.
Top-selling cars.
If you look at VFACTS for year-to-date February, the total sum of the vehicle you just mentioned is 4.
4. Not this week or this year?
Year-to-date February.
This year.
Yeah.
So there is an electric ute on the market.
Yeah.
They've sold 4.
It's not the world's most desirable brand, but good on them for producing it. It's out in the market. They're on their own, which is terrific. $92,990 is what it's going to cost you, which is less than your number one selling Ford Raptor or your Toyota Rogue. It's just an expensive car. People don't want to buy it, and it won't do what the others do in the short term.
If all of this, John, is about, and I know you've got skin in the game with hybrids, you sold me a hybrid.
Yeah.
So I'm just declaring all that here. Not that it's anything new, I've told people before. But if all of this was really about the environment, one thing governments, state and federal, for years should have been doing is incentivising the stepping stone to the end goal, which is the hybrid vehicle. And Toyota, they put a lot on hybrids, more than electric vehicles. So I'm sure you'll back me up when I say this. But when we bought our RAV4, there were no government rebates, no subsidy, nor should there be necessarily, but there weren't any. But if it were a fully electric vehicle, you could have had money raining from the sky from federal, state and local councils. Here, have money, take an electric car off the market.
Exactly.
Now, we did it because we liked the car, but there was no incentive to buy the hybrid.
No.
And there remains no incentive to buy a hybrid. We could have been halfway there, reducing the national emissions of the fleet if we incentivised hybrids, and yet, for whatever reason, it was all electric or nothing when it came to subsidies.
Spot on. And look, let's assume that they don't, support or there's no incentives to buy a hybrid. If you look at history, since the Prius was launched, the hybrid went from a $10,000 premium in some models to now being equal to a non-hybrid vehicle.
That's right.
So that's why we're saying you're right in terms of the target. You're just wrong in terms of the timing. We can get there, but it's going to take much more time than what you're proposing. And the other part of this is, look, we spoke about that, the ute that's maybe not affordable and not selling too many of them. At the moment, we still have a crisis in our industry where you can't supply motor vehicles. And I know Chris Bowen's done a pretty good job talking to some of the dealers as well, which is good. And I've had discussions with, competitive dealers and dealers in my franchises as well. Chris Bowen has walked into dealerships, and I know the opposition leader has as well, had a look around and said, hey, if you're telling me you can't supply new cars, what are all these? You know what the answer was?
What?
These are electric cars that we can't sell because the consumer doesn't want to buy them.
So they're on the lot. They can't move them on.
And those vehicles around the $50,000 mark, no luxury car tax whatsoever. So the consumer is saying every year out of the million cars that we sell that it will buy that are new, 7% of those are electric. The majority of those are Teslas. So why are we trying to ram it down the throat of the consumer? Let the consumer have the choice.
Just before you go, speaking of consumers, they're the customers. And I made this point time and time again. The nickel industry, the government, the BHPs and Twiggy Forrest, they said, look, the world is going to want green nickel. They're not going to want that environmentally polluting junk out of Indonesia. It's cheaper, but everyone's got a conscience, and so they're going to pay the premium for Australian green nickel. Well, they're now down in Canberra with a begging bowl saying, bail us out, no one's buying our nickel. The government comes along to your industry and says, listen, John and friends, look, you're doing all right. So we're going to change this by the 6 years down the track. X percentage, 60-odd% of the cars you sell are going to have to be electric. Otherwise, effectively, you're going to be fined, and there's cross subsidies and all the rest of it going on. Now, government, dealers, it doesn't matter. You can put whatever you want on the lot. But if the customer says, you know what, that's all lovely, but no, I still want that diesel car, what are you going to do?
Well, we're going to be selling a lot of second-hand diesel cars. I can assure you my used car business is going to grow. But look, on a serious note, we deliver out of my business about 450 new cars a month. We're not going to need 260 staff to deliver 200 cars, because that's what it will go in the short term if we let this pass. So we're talking about unemployment. We're talking about families that are in the car industry, everything that is connected to the car industry in terms of suppliers. The ramifications are huge. So the government really needs to consider the timing, listen to the dealer, which is the voice of the customer, which is what we do for a living. We listen to our customers. We produce the cars the customers want to buy.
You'd go broke if you didn't.
Exactly.
Great to see you. Thank you for coming in.
Thanks for having me, Michael.
All the best, John Rocker. John Rocker, as you know, from Sydney City, Lexus and Toyota, top bloke, one of the best dealers in the country. You've heard it from him. What do you make of it? 131873. What does Chris Bowen make of it? That's the important point. It's 27 past 1.